Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Teri Schultz.
Yay. Ready? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last panel of the day. On the second day of GlobeSec 2025, I'm Teri Schultz. For many years, I've been covering NATO and European defense, and it seems that I spend almost all of my time lately covering Europe's attempts to finance that defense, especially as you've been hearing from the last panel and so many other panels here at GlobeSec, in light of NATO's impending 5% of GDP spending pledge that we expect to see at The Hague next week. So we're going to be talking in this panel about the creative, and some say too creative, ways that Europe is looking at financing European defense. Joining me here for this panel, Jakub Landovský. He is the former Deputy Minister of Defense from Czechia, also former ambassador to NATO. Faysal Rahman, he is the Managing Director of Deutsche Bank. And you'll see why that's important soon. Guntram, Wolff, Senior Fellow from Bruegel. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me here. Oh, and I should say Bruegel is one of Brussels' premier think tanks, especially on economic issues. And we also definitely want your participation, especially those of you who've managed to stick it out for today, so I will definitely be leaving time for questions, and we also take them, as you know by now, through Slido with the code GlobeSecForumHV. So I'm going to start with Jakub, and he's promised to be provocative, so let's hold him to it. As someone who's been through infinite number of NATO negotiations, also national government negotiations about funding, what do you make of this 5% pledge? Because as it seems to those of us covering it, it seems like it might be a lot of very hurried negotiations, paper pushing, creative accounting to get to 5% or 3.5 plus 1.5. And is this really going to be a qualitative increase in NATO's warfighting capability if governments don't even know how they're going to finance it, but they're going to sign on this paper next week?
Oh, thank you, Teri. It's a great question. I think it's pretty clear for the 3.5%. That's basically the integrated defense ministry's defense expenditure. 1.5 is a question, but I promised something, and I'd like to deliver because I was thinking what makes a good speech. And it's not the words, it's not the eloquency, it's the follow-through. If you will say, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, and it happens, it's the great speech. If you say in a Munich conference, like Putin said, this is going to be different, I'm going to attack you, and you follow through, it's an infamous speech. And I like to be like saying something that will happen. So we'll probably agree hastily, like you say, on something similar to the promise in Wales. 5% composite, but we're not going to deliver.
Aim to move towards wasn't a very solid promise.
Line is very important, whether it's 31, 32, but we haven't delivered on 2% yet.
Yep.
So who are we really trying to impress here? Europe is really quickly to fall off the right course when the pressure stops mounting. And we should remind ourselves, in the 1950s, Europe was spending 7% of GDP. Then it was dropping, and still in the 70s it was more than 4%. So we can definitely do it. But everybody is trying to get the most of security for the least amount of money. Iceland got it best, they pay 0.
True. And how is Czechia doing?
Czechia, I always at the ministry said, this graph looks like a hockey stick, because we are still moving very slowly towards the goal, and in the end we have to reach it. We reached it in 1 year.
When you really wanted to.
So 1.36, and then almost 0.7 in one go. So you can imagine how the money is spent. It's basically 4 payments for something. So you are right, we need to think deeply about how to make the most effort on the dime. And Ukraine is showing us that we can be very agile, the innovation cycle can be in months, we can do things differently and put our money when they are really worth.
And in fact, Secretary General Rutte always uses the hockey stick as the example of what he doesn't want to see. But
Denmark
they're
is
heading
the hockey
toward that
nation
again.
as well as Czechia, so we have similar parables.
Fair enough. We're going to have brief interventions at the beginning so we can have a lot of conversation. Faysal, I was moderating with European Investment Bank President Nadia Calvino actually on Tuesday, and she made an announcement related to you. First, her announcement was that the EIB is going to triple loans and guarantees available for defense up to $3 billion, which is just a conversation unthinkable for EIB. Just a few years ago, you couldn't even bring up defense. They were alerted allergic to talking about it, so this is a huge, huge change. She announced more support through commercial banks for SMEs when they're working on defense-related projects, and she announced an agreement with Deutsche Bank for €1 billion to finance defense-related spending. So I want to hear what this means for Deutsche Bank, what a change it is, especially for a German bank. Germans also haven't traditionally been that excited about spending more on defense. So, I mean, this is a sea change taking place, at least in your industry already.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is a great point. Firstly, it's fantastic to be here, and thank you to GlobeSec for ultimately inviting me. It's a real honor. So we've always been in defense post-Russia-Ukraine. We decided to intensify exposure to the industry quite significantly. And what that essentially meant in practice was concentrating on 3 pillars, which was giving more capital to existing defense corporates we already bank. Number 1. Number 2 was targeting new defense corporates. And then number 3 was financing sovereigns who are looking to either the capital to replenish existing defense equipment or increase defense supplies. Now, the issue you face in the EU is you've got over 5,000 SMEs from a supply chain perspective that are really critical to the ecosystem in defense. And what we did with the EIB was, as you said, worked in partnership with them, had a very intensive meeting as to how we can work together to help the ecosystem. And what this essentially agreement is, they give us a loan and we're able to deploy that capital across SMEs within defense across Europe. Essentially what that means in practice is they'll be able to scale up a lot more quickly. They're really important to the big primes, and we'll be able to continue to support. So I'm very proud to be the first European bank to ultimately have this partnership with the EIB, but there's a lot more to come.
And it's something you couldn't have done without this EIB backing, is that right?
Well, it's important to have that partnership with them. We speak to them on a number of other topics as well, not only defense. And I think we don't only have a partnership with the EIB, we've got other partnerships as well with, for example, the European Commission, who we advise on a policy-making perspective. We work with other institutions such as the European Defence Agency, ASD, ADS. So my point is we're very plugged into the ecosystem. We understand what the challenges are from a defence perspective, what sort of issues a lot of our CEOs and CFOs are facing, and most importantly, how can we allocate capital in the most efficient manner.
It's interesting because there still is a lot of hesitancy in some quarters in some countries about lending to defense-related projects, isn't there? Some still don't want to touch it.
Yeah, I think certainly post-Russia-Ukraine, there's been a change of sentiment, and that's primarily thanks to regulators, politicians, rating agencies. So, for example, Moody's have come out and said that the social element in ESG for defense has moved from negative to neutral, and they see it moving to positive. So things like this is really helpful in changing the sentiment, and I think it's really important to ultimately analyze the actual defense equipment and look at each case on a case-by-case basis. So if you're looking at a tank, and how you use that tank, if you're using it to protect a neighbor, that is different from when you're using it to ultimately attack a country. So I think you need to analyze each fact on a case-by-case basis. And certainly what we are doing, we've set up a global defense working call within the bank. We want to do more to support the industry and do more to ultimately help the supply chain.
It's just remarkable to be hearing these things again after having covered this for so long. And Guntram, that's something that I want to turn to you to talk about, because you've been publishing very prolifically on efforts to fund defense. And I'm really interested to hear from you. With all of this available funding now through the EU coming up with 800 billion euros through various ways, working with the banks, the EIB backing, is this sustainable? Is this a sustainable way to fund a sustainable increase in expanding European defense output? Or is everybody just scrambling in a panic and we don't really know how this is going to work out? A short-term vision. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Let me also make 3 quick points. I think the first point is on the funding of companies. I think we've really gone a long way. I mean, it used to be very stigmatized. Now it's changing. You see these major initiatives, EIB, Deutsche Bank. I mean, you see in capital markets a greater openness to fund defense companies. And frankly, the returns of investments into companies are really quite handsome at the moment. So I don't think the key issue at the moment is the funding of the companies. The second point is the key issue is, of course, the funding of the public budgets. So we need public budgets. We need procurement agencies to have the resources to buy. And for that, of course, there have been the big initiatives which are mostly at the national level, so the change of the fiscal rules, including the change in the German constitutional debt brake, which, of course, is a game changer for Germany. And the European initiatives that you mentioned, the 800 billions, are essentially, almost all of it is about national borrowing. And here comes my third concern, and that was your question on the sustainability, is that this national borrowing will lead to more national procurement and will have a tendency to reinforce the nationalism in the defense industries as well.
Not the joint procurement.
And I think that's the point where really we need to work more, because what we see at the moment in Europe, and I've been tracking sort of procurement across European countries in quite some detail, what we are seeing is that individual European countries are procuring, but they are procuring still, even with all the budgets we are having, in actually pretty small numbers. And they do so from their domestic companies primarily, which means that these domestic companies very often produce in low quantities. And these low quantities means high unit costs. And that's where the economist has to say, okay, let's try to find ways of procuring jointly, integrating our markets, introduce more competition in defense markets, so that prices come down, the quality goes up, and what you get is actually literally a bigger bang for the buck. And I think that bigger bang for the buck is ultimately what citizens will want, because citizens, of course, they are ready to spend and they are ready to invest into defense if they really think this will deliver the kind of security and deterrence that we promise to deliver by 2030. If the money mostly goes into high prices, and we've seen by now evidence that a lot of equipment actually becomes more expensive in the last years instead of prices actually falling, and they should be falling as the quantities go up, then I think there will be at some stage a backlash. And that's why it's so important that in Europe we go beyond sort of just raising the money and just talking about 3.5, you name it. And, we are far, as Jakub was saying, we are far away from the 3.5. So we come out with these numbers, which are nice headline numbers. Perhaps they will please the US president, which then I guess is a good thing. But at the end of the day, we need the capabilities. And for that, you need cost-effective purchases.
But the mechanisms exist for that joint procurement. And if Yuri Shedovich is here, as he promised he would be, I don't know, from EDA, they have made these agreements. There exist, I don't know, dozens and dozens of ways they could jointly procure. So it's a psychological shift. You don't need to come up with pots of money. You need to come up with pots of new thinking, right?
Well, I mean, so you need a certain readiness to move beyond this, and the worry by now is many member states, many national agencies, they basically think, oh, but this is my little defense industry, it's my little piece of national sovereignty, and by the way, it's also my jobs in my sort of constituency. And I think the political economy now is different in the sense that there's so much more spending that the tide is lifting actually all boats, right? So even with more competition, I mean, all of these companies will be better off. There will be job creation. I mean, I looked at the top 10 European defense companies. Their employment has gone up by 11% in the last 2 years. So there's job creation in this sector, lots of job creation. So nobody should worry that your local constituent, your local factory will be out of job because of a bit more competition in Europe.
Jakub, Czechia is traditionally a big defense country in the EU, big defense manufacturing country. So are you seeing those trends? I mean, here, are your companies willing to look for joint procurement? Are they seeking those deals out, or are they also still protecting their own industry, even when we look at the incredible need of helping Ukraine?
Of course, in some areas they do, like the higher tier products, like the vehicle. But for example, we are pretty good in ammunition. And then you see the power of standardization. And in NATO, we always fought with the idea that the companies will shelter their space with extra layer of legal prohibitions that will not allow the soldiers to just load the 155 into any 155 gun. But I think it was absolutely essential to name the flawed market. It's flawed from the beginning. It's a collection of monopsons that are buying, the states are buying. That's why it's so important to keep the competition going. I really agree with that. And let's look at the European landscape. The nations are buying, and usually they are using exclusions to buy from their own stock. Because they can, because the army can always do some tricks to have a special product only for the French army, only from the German army. So I think to accept the new definition of a product is really important. If we look at Ukrainian drones, what are they? It's defined by software. Many of the modern products are defined, and communication interface. These can all be regulated. And then it's a collection of different things that you need to make and put together. It's a battery, it's a shell, and it's a skeleton, and it's a couple of engines, the electric motors. So that's how we should think in a modern world about defense product, and also in the terms of production. About the ammunition, my last remark, I was always pressing in NATO to increase the mandatory stockpiles of munition, because that will force states to do bigger orders from the industry, which will then spur the investment into production lines, because everybody is hesitant.
Still.
And that's the problem. Everybody's waiting for everybody else, and the only lively place for business is a market. US can do it because they have this rule that always you should end up with two competing, the head-on, two competing. It's not perfect, but it's an attempt. In Europe, it's a collection of national interests. Last thing, Secretary General Stoltenberg was a very, very witty guy. And he told us a story once, which is very funny and also instrumental in that case. He said, as a Prime Minister of Norway, I decided I want to have a new destroyers. And I went outside of the Norwegian shipyards, and I organized a competition. And we have terrific Spain-built destroyers for cheaper money with better capability, and then I immediately lost the elections. And that's about it. Everything starts with the politics.
Yeah.
It freed him up to be NATO's SecGen for an eternity, so, you know. Faysal, will you be building in any sort of requirements to open up competition in your lending? I mean, will there be any kinds of strings attached to the money that you now will make available to companies?
Yeah, so it's really a combination of making sure it's in line with the EIB strategy in that particular deal, as well as our particular policies. We've got a very clear policy around what we can and can't do around defence. It essentially strikes a balance between making sure our shareholders are protected, but also at the same time is commercial for the particular clients that we cover. So we take into key questions such as where the underlying goods are coming from, what the underlying goods are, where the underlying goods are going, and who's producing them, essentially. And the other thing we do is make sure that individuals within the bank all have an opinion as to how this particular deal should be structured, so that we don't miss any blind spots, essentially. But to put it into perspective, we've significantly ramped up the team. So when the whole Credit Suisse situation happened, we decided to hire defence industry bankers who not only had a good knowledge of the actual industry, but they're also able to bring in their relationships and their experience. So we're extremely well versed in the industry, and we want to do more.
Yet more jobs, right, Guntram?
Yeah, I mean, let me perhaps just add one dimension, which I think is really important. I mean, we are seeing also a revolution, of course, in the defense industry. I mean, we have a lot of old established players, but we are seeing the emergence of new small defense companies that are sort of at the cutting edge of the digital AI integrated battlefield kind of arms that we need, and that have been proven to be very effective in Ukraine. And so one of the worries I have is that this tendency to borrow and buy national might reinforce that these companies actually stay small, because the little German AI company delivers just for the German army, the little French AI company just for the French army, and the result will be that we will miss out on important technological developments that give us the scale to bring down again the cost, but really, frankly, also to get the fighting effectiveness that we need. So I think this issue of how do we nurture this ecosystem of startups, there's two aspects that are central. One is, can they grow into a big European market or only into a small market? And can they get the funding? And some of the startups, of course, do have a problem because in Europe, there's not just the ESG rules, but we just don't have very well-functioning capital markets in Europe, especially for these kind of venture capitalists, for these kind of startups. Yeah? And so one risk that I see is that some of these firms will actually be seeking funding primarily in the United States capital markets, and that of course also then can be, under certain political constellations, at least be a source of worry.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, you asked about the consolidation of the defense market, and I have a good example how not to do it. There was a Eurofighter, and you remember that a couple of nations decided they were going to build it together, and they have all divided the projects into parts, and they didn't charge premium on it. It was hard to negotiate how it's going to unfold, so it was behind the schedule, much more expensive. And this is not the way we should spend the money together for the sake of crawling through the European regulation, which will say 2 or 3 countries must agree to do something together. Because you have to take risk as an entrepreneur. And the contracts are, in essence, basically, you will be paid your expenses plus some premium, which is not very stimulating for the innovation in the environment. So these fundamental changes, and if I have to bring this example from the United States, if you look at the Starlink versus Kuiper from Amazon, if you look at the American ability to shoot 160 rockets per year, Europe does 3. 95% from Elon Musk because it's refillable. Yep. And the contract with Elon Musk was basically, I will get the target price, and it's my way how I'll get there. So the savings were huge, and the constraints can really drive the innovation cycle. So we should be more courageous in Europe, take risks a little bit, and try to push ourselves forward in a non-traditional ways.
But other than the new money that Deutsche Bank has, I feel like we could have had this exact same conversation at the start of the Ukraine war. We could have had this same conversation more than 3 years ago at the start of the Ukraine war. We were having these conversations about how standardization was necessary and way behind schedule, and how people needed to be more courageous and work together. I mean, why are we still here? And what would, if a war next door isn't going to stimulate this kind of new thinking, what is?
I'm living in a nightmare of déjà vu, like you, Teri, but I'm outside of the government's remit for a year. Maybe when I get back, I can do something about it, but I share your sentiment.
Well, I don't have to prepare for panels anymore. I just call up my notes from 2022, sadly. So I have a question. I have a layperson question for you guys. Is it smart? No, what? It's true. Is it smart, when you look at Rearm Europe, for example, to be releasing the debt brake on highly indebted countries so they can spend on defense, if we're looking at the long-term consequences of this? Again, when you say, why are we doing this all of a sudden? Of course, we're doing this so that there's a great summit in The Hague and there's a declaration that everybody agrees to. But what happens after that? If you are encouraging these countries to spend just on defense, and they're already in some deep trouble, where are we going to be when people sober up after The Hague?
Well, I mean, look, I think some countries in Europe will not and should not fund this with primarily with deficits, and I think these countries actually know it, and they are very reluctant to do this. And I'm not going to name any of them, but I think I'm a Eurozone veteran, so I know we all know the countries that have a lot of debt in Europe. So that's one point. I think there will have to be budget priorities, and the bulk of the spending needs will be put on the shoulders of the countries from, let's say, from Germany to Finland, right? Which incidentally have quite a bit of fiscal space, all of these countries. So that's one point. The second point I want to make, however, is that let's not think that this is only a zero-sum game, right? I mean, so we know that defense spending, there's a good paper just published in the American Economic Review showing that US defense spending has long-term positive growth effects in the United States. Has had and they look at 120 years.
Even though that's declined, the only NATO member.
And the mechanism is through research and development. So if we are open to sort of use defense spending also to innovate, some of this will also have benefits on long-term growth. And then the third point is, of course, there's the short-term stimulus of it, right? I mean, so you spend a euro on defense, it will have a short-term Keynesian effect of, let's say, half a dollar or so half a euro in additional GDP.
But if what you're saying is true, which I don't doubt, that these countries will not make themselves, will not sign up to the debt brake exclusion and so on, they're still going to sign or approve this document in 2 weeks that says they're going to fund 5%, up to 5%, or at least 3.5% of defense spending. And then they really don't have any idea how they're going to do it, do they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid this NATO summit will be a lot of headline numbers done to sort of please the transatlantic relations, and only half of it will be implemented.
Okay. I promised I'm going to let other people enjoy themselves like I am right here, asking questions. Do we have questions from people actually in the room before I go to Slido? Yes, ma'am. Is that Patty? Oh, hi.
Hey, Teri. Patty Morcia from the United States. I spent 20 years in the Pentagon doing strategic planning, information warfare, et cetera, and then 14 and a half years in the intel community doing global futures, counter-ISIS, et cetera. My question is, I've heard many panels over the last 2 days talk about what we need to give to Ukraine and how we need to invest in European defense industry, et cetera. But I haven't heard anyone talk about how we do a coherent requirements process, or where you're getting your requirements from for doing coalition of the willing set of capabilities for countering hybrid warfare, not traditional warfare. And often those tools, as we know, are less expensive, but they're not the shiny, glamorous stuff we're used to funding traditionally. So how do we does anyone have any awareness of a requirements process that is comprehensively considering modern warfare requirements and not just traditional conventional war fighting, which we're not really seeing as much? We're evolving.
Yeah. And approval of the new capability targets is just a week old. So, I mean, while they're classified, maybe we would presumably have some of these things in it if they're going to. Guntram, you know?
Yeah, I mean, just two quick points. I think the first is we need to shift, indeed, the debate from fiscal to capabilities. I think that's very important, not just spend, but what do we need to spend on? What are the capabilities that are missing? How do we get them? Where do we get them quickest and most efficient and sustainably in the long term, right?
And you've written a paper on that, so you can look at his views on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one point. And then on the hybrid specifically, I mean, I had the pleasure of speaking to EU finance ministers many years ago at the Finnish presidency of the European Union, where they were already concerned about hybrid threats. That was several years before now, and they were exactly concerned about what is happening now, namely deep sea cables in the Baltic Sea being cut. And, this is the kind of stuff we know for years. We know that it involves, I mean, there's the physical sort of stuff that you need to sort of deter tankers from having the anchor and, in that region dropped. But then there is a whole set of financial stability issues behind it. You need to have systems in place to stress test banks if the internet cable comes down. You have to have emergency procedures in place. You need to do these kind of stress tests between banks, for example. I mean, there's a whole sort of set of issues where we have done some of these resilience tests at the G7 level. And my understanding is that the result of this discussion in the ECOFIN many years ago was then that also at the European level, there have been financial stability stress tests against hybrid threats, which is absolutely central, because if you have a hybrid threat that strikes and your financial system is down for more than 24 hours, you actually have civil war very quickly because people can't buy bread and milk, right? So this is absolutely central, and I think policymakers have been made aware of it for a couple of years now, but I agree more needs to be done in that space.
Yeah,
You've been inside that room. Oh, Faysal?
Yeah, sure. Just to add to that, the issue that we've kind of faced in Europe is you've sort of got 27 national sovereignty requirements, and as a result, you've got 27 quite bespoke defence strategies. And so to give you an example, in Europe, you've got 62 land platforms for tanks, whereas in the US you've got 8. So my point is, if we were able to coordinate defense spending a lot better in Europe, that would help the overall ecosystem. But you raise a very good, valid point in terms of how can we ultimately look at the battlefield in the next 10, 15 years. I think there's been players in the defense space, such as Helsing, which have come in and put a big emphasis on AI and technology and bringing that into defense. You've also got Anduril in the US who've come in and completely disrupted the market in terms of being able to produce almost the same spec of defense equipment, but at a much cheaper cost, but are able to scale up very quickly. Then you've got Arch Robotics, who are putting a massive emphasis on unmanned drones, unmanned vehicles, etc. The issue you face with these smaller sort of defense tech startups is they don't have a track record. Therefore, when the governments are given contracts, they're more likely to give it to the big primes. So what they're doing now is these sort of defense startups are teaming up with the big primes. And a good example is Helsing teamed up quite well with Saab, and they were able to provide to the Swedish armed forces after that. So my point is, it will take a bit of time. We're heading in the right direction, but we're certainly not there. But you raise a very valid point.
Jakub, you've been in those meetings. Are people awake to this?
Yes, they are. And not everything is classified. It's really an excellent
capability
question.
targets are classified.
I'll tell you some numbers from the bygone era. Maybe Anna will remember them.
Did you say Biden or bygone?
Bygone. But to the traditional coherent defense planning process, it needs to be threat-based. So if you look at the numbers that we had year before, it was 300,000 troops at the highest level of readiness, which is basically 100 brigades, which is basically what Russia has on the front at one time. So you can see this was counted for the battlefield. Now it's a little bit more on the Russian side, so we need to adjust, but threat-based. But there is a very important distinction. From the domain perspective, Europe is only expected to do something in air, sea, and land domain conventionally. And it's going to be those, 300,000 plus troops, 440 airframes, and 250-something ships and submersibles. But there is a huge gap in the strategic weapons domain. Nobody is expected from Europe to do a nuclear buildup. And in the 21st century, the basis for security will be the same as in the 20th century. And China is ramping up its nuclear plan. They're going to have 1,000 nukes at 2030. So US is, in a good position to ask to spend even more on the conventional from Europe, because they are spending 3.5%, give or take, even though they now passed the 1 trillion line, because they will have to compensate in the very strategic domain of nuclear weapons the European inability to address the issue. And that's what gives them the upper hand. And that's why Donald Trump has announced this Golden Dome project, which is very, very interesting. It's a game changer of the same sort as the SDI for Ronald Reagan, because it will protect America and maybe its allies, it's a good question, from the attack of the nuclear holders in the world. So Europe will have to step up much more in a conventional domain against Russia and terrorism in a NATO's world, and that's what's expected. And the money is not really above the expectation. The question is the line, how we get there. And that's the question of our credibility in implementing, because in 2% line, I think there is still like 7 countries maybe that haven't passed the line yet. Yeah. So I'm cautious. But I also saw when the real pressure starts, Europeans are able to do something. And I'm very much afraid about the industry's ability to quickly do something. That's the problem, to quickly do something. I think the consensus on the banking side that defense is a public good is already there. And it's a public good because you cannot exclude anyone from defense, elderly, younger. And that's very good. But it took us some time. So we were deliberately shooting ourselves in the leg for past 7 years, stopping the money flow. Last thing, capital. I think we need really the European capital market without constraints, which goes to bankruptcy laws, which goes to acceptance of failure in the system, which I think is very, very important. Europe tries to save everyone, regardless of how good they are.
Well, a couple of things. NATO says that this time, or Rutte says that this time there would be checks. There would be, you wouldn't wait until the end, that you would have to prove that at regular intervals you are spending this money and you are spending it the way that you said you were going to, and it needs to be done. That would perhaps help.
And of course, the big question will be the 1.5% for the hybrid, and I haven't addressed that. And that's a big if. And I think part of the Hybrid, which in my books, it's different than the Russian books, is basically plausible deniability, meddling with your nation under the threshold of open warfare under your own account. And this is dwelling on the social cohesion, basically. And there are two types of cohesion. One was addressed, that's the European one, and I can say Italy, but it was omitted here, or Spain, or other countries are so high in the debt that it might destroy the cohesion in Europe if they will borrow from the same pouch. In the society, it's the very same. The social contracts work if the people feel that it is just. When it stops working, and it's part of the resilience, people will be vulnerable to the foreign meddling. So the social expenses, which is in Europe highest in the world, has of course their value in keeping the society shielded. But we have to make it sustainable, and maybe find a way to fund the hard power that is missing from Europe. Europe is like someone who's talking loud and doesn't have a big stick behind his back. That's why we are not at the table in negotiating the peace in Ukraine. That's why nobody called from Israel tonight that something's going to happen. Donald Trump knew, we didn't.
Okay. Can I take another one from the room? Yes. Oh, Giuseppe. See, I have too many friends in the audience. Is anybody else that I don't know want to ask a question first? Okay, Giuseppe, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Teri. It'll be very quick. Giuseppe Spatafora.
Can you stand up, Giuseppe,
yes,
please?
Yes, I work at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Two very quick questions. One, are you worried that member states are going to use the extra money to buy more American weapons to reduce the trade deficit as opposed to European? And second question on the 1.5% is sort of the flip side of the question asked before. What are the chances that countries start doing some creative bookkeeping and putting things such as agricultural subsidies into defense-related spending?
And you might hear from his accent where he's from.
I understood. I'll be quick. In the low-tier market, like the munition, we should buy from everywhere, and we should have an extra capacity on the line for the time of war. In the mid-segment, we should buy European whenever possible, bundle up, consolidate the market, but keep it competitive. But there is also the high tier. And Europe doesn't have anything to offer in certain areas. So we will have to respect that someone else has the 5th-generation fighter, and we don't even make cell phones. So we have to respect that and do it with the Americans, maybe sometimes Israelis, or maybe in the future Ukrainians that will be well ahead of us in the innovation sphere.
Guntram, you've looked into this extensively.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly see the point, but the problem is, of course, that our dependencies in high tech, our import dependencies from the US are in high tech, basically. They are not in the mid tech and they are not in the low tech, they're in the high tech. And it's exactly there where, of course, this creates also vulnerabilities in the trade war. So to think that this is a solution to the trade war, we buy American weapons, I don't think so. I mean, it might be a short-term appeasement strategy, but in the long term, it only increases U.S. leverage over Europe to extract more on the trade front. So I think we have really a dilemma here, and we need to massively invest into R&D and creating these kind of capabilities ourselves. And if you look at the R&D numbers, the U.S. spends so much more on R&D in defense than Europe does. That is really the big gap, right? And that's what we have to fix. And I think that's the only way, weaning ourselves off the technological dependency from the United States.
And at the moment, the gap is something like 5 years. Europe is 5 years behind the US.
Oh, yeah, it will take many, many years.
Yeah.
And the other point I'd add is if you look at sort of the imports of defence equipment into Europe between 2019 and 2023, it was approximately 55% from the US. That was up from 35% from the previous 5 years. So this whole argument about killing the switch to the US, if anyone says that we need to stop relying on the US, it's a matter of investing now in our ecosystem and our supply chain to be able to essentially do that. We still rely quite heavily on the US for example, F-35s, subcomponents, technology, which are really key, critical defense infrastructure that we need in Europe. But I think it's really important to cooperate on that area.
Okay, if we're quick, I can take one more from the room and the top vote getter from Slido. Yes. Stand up, please, and tell us who you are. Can you wait? The mic is coming, sorry.
Director of NATO.
My name is Colonel Groeneveld. I'm the director of the NATO Command and Control Center of Excellence. And I have a question on this. We see the switch on the side where it's not only to R&D, but it's also that we now have commercial industry that actually is bringing the innovation, and therefore our complete relation with industry is changing. I wonder, can you reflect on if we switch from investments to exploitation budgets in our MODs, so if we wouldn't force nations to put 20% in investment, we could also switch the narrative of buying systems that you can touch and that you will get in 10 years towards a more services-related relationship with industry.
Thank you, and thank you for your service. Panelists? It appears to be a hard question.
That's it. I mean, so I'm not a specialist exactly on the question you posed, but I mean, it seems to me indeed that sort of the industry aspect, right, and the service aspect. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we are doing and that we will be needing is increasingly away from the traditional sort of defense heavy metal sort of equipment towards more software-based online services, right? And in this domain, we do have big gaps in Europe, right? And so getting more into this space, I think, would be the right strategy. But I'm not sure I fully got your question correctly, but perhaps...
Maybe I finally understood. Is it about the 20% into new equipment? The traditional, like 50 mandatory personal, 30% for the upkeep, and 20% to the new equipment. That shows us that the NATO rules are slightly obsolete in how they are constructed. I couldn't agree more. But if you change the new equipment into some sort of R&D, it will change the organization. So I kind of agree. But the problem is how to measure the spending in R&D and whether we have the luxury of time, whether we should not more focus on the gaps that exist. For example, Czechia doesn't have an air defense. If the Ukrainian scenario happens here, it will be a real bloodshed. So I think R&D is fine, but maybe let's buy some Iris-T or Patriots or whomever makes them.
Okay, so that feeds well into the top vote getter on Slido. Should there be a guideline for equipment spending on top of overall defense spending of the guideline to modernize NATO forces more effectively? Because right now you have a percentage that you have to spend, but it doesn't tell you what you have to spend it on except related to your capability targets. Okay. Yes, that'll be our last answer, and
sorry.
Be brief. No, that's okay. Go ahead.
There was an idea to do more in cyber. But I would now use the opportunity for this 1.5% to do the things that are not integrated into the defense world, like cyber, and they can be beneficial for the whole society, and I will shift them there. In terms of the traditional, it really helps to increase the demands for readiness, which includes the munition, which I already talked about. And of course, it's a great guideline if you are able to have a unified platform. The problem of Europe is that the European armies are like a bonsai armies, I would say. They are like a tree, everything is orderly, but it's too small to be a real tree. US Army is a different animal or different plant. So we need to integrate these bonsai armies into a working war machine. And that really needs the not only interoperability, but real interchangeability. And that brings us to the, for example, airframe
But
question.
I have to make you short because the other...
Sorry, I'm ending. Thank you very much.
No.
I'm obedient, please.
No, Faysal.
No, it's a great point. I think certainly the more visibility we have as to what equipment is going to be procured and ultimately bought, that would allow our CEOs and CFOs to invest more heavily into what areas they need to put money into. And from a financing perspective, it would certainly help where we can allocate the capital.
But I mean, just to say, the 20% target on equipment spending, I mean, is now easily met by most countries because defense spending has gone up. And as it has gone up, it has been mostly used for equipment and not so much for personnel. I think the next thing will be we will also have to increase the troop size, and that will be costly, actually. And so ultimately, I think the 20% target is going to be very helpful. Adding a bit on munition and readiness, I think, is very good. But otherwise, I think really let military planners decide this and not sort of bureaucratic approach.
Okay, well, I always, when I came to this panel, I thought we've been talking about this so many times. All of us, even Guntram and I, we've been on panels over the last days a lot. And I thought, is there anything, can we bring energy to this? Are there new ideas? And you three have proven that, yes, we can. And that was really interesting. And I really enjoyed this, and I think our audience probably did too. So thank you three. And then to everyone else, we need to stay seated in a few moments. We are going to welcome the Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, to hear a call for peace in a fragmented world. And then we should leave. No, but everyone else stay seated, if I read my notes correctly. Is that correct? God? Okay.